Hey everybody, it's MacroBioBoi here, and I wanted to go over the changes coming to the Necromancer in Season 8, and the fact that we just put out our updated tier list on Maxroll. Now, I'd recorded a video about this right when the patch notes had dropped. I put in a ton of information, and I've basically just seen not only just like some confusion online, but also just kind of like a little bit of like a what does it all mean in a more concise and digestible way. So I figured we'd just go ahead and take a look at the tier list because I finally have them updated, and we'll talk through the various things that you need to understand about it. But basically right here, what you're looking at was my calculations of expected pit tier clears based off of the scaling during the PTR, plus the changes to build strength walking out of the PTR. The sad thing about this, though, is that we also know that the developers have changed the scaling to still be harder than Season 7, but easier than what we saw in the PTR. Sadly, a bunch of us try to sit down and do the math, and we just can't quite calculate exactly what that means. So we're going to have to see that in this season. So rather than waste your time trying to give you exact tiers that I expect you to be able to clear, let's talk about the tier lists and the expectation of what that means. Now, we obviously have the totality of all classes in a single tier list. That's in our endgame and pit push builds tier list. Now, this is kind of one of the first places that I saw a little bit of confusion on. Most notably, there are differences between like what we're saying and what other websites are saying. And I want to talk to that just very quickly. The Maxroll tier lists that we have, because we actually have a number of tier lists, have to cover different things that occur in the game. The endgame and pit push tier list really relates to ultimately pushing as far into the pit as possible. This is where you see the super strong builds like Bloodwave from last season, or in Season 6, all of the ridiculously broken Spiritborns. This is why they were such high tiering in the tier list itself. But what this doesn't really do a great job of is direct you on how good of a speed farming build is, meaning running lower pit tiers to be able to level up your glyphs, doing Hell Tide, doing whatever the seasonal tide is. This season, it's the Incursions, or as I like to call it, Mountain Dew Tide, or doing things like Infernal Horde, etc. Because it turns out that running the pit and doing anything else in the game is basically two completely different experiences. Builds that are amazing at pit pushing will quite literally die in the open world because monsters don't live long enough to reset its cooldowns. This is a very common thing that happens with the Necromancer and Soul Rift. You literally don't reset it fast enough because everything dies in one hit and you can't proc Decrepify. Whereas in the pit, I'm fighting a monster group for 2 minutes, you know I'm going to reset that thing. So when we're talking about the endgame pit push list, we're talking about the builds that we think will literally do the highest pit tier possible. The second point of confusion that I tend to see is that basically everybody just reads S tier and then says everything below this must be trash garbage. Why would you ever play it? Well, one, oddly enough, most people don't only care about only doing just the pit and pushing as hard as possible. Not really. In fact, pit pushing tends to be what you, on your gear, on your game knowledge, at your skill level, can do. So when I say pit pushing, I'm talking about maybe doing 150 on Bloodwave last season. When you're talking about pit pushing, you're talking about maybe doing tier 100 on a minion build. It literally just means something different per person. But I just want to give a little bit of insight here, because I would hope that this can kind of help to demystify this reality. Typically, when we're looking at this tier list, now that we have the pit as a metric, we're talking about a difference of 10 pit tiers. So the difference between S tier and A tier is that the best A tier build should be about 10 pit tiers below the worst S tier build. And it goes on from there. So the worst A tier build will be about 10 pit tiers above the best B tier build. When you're talking about like being able to get into World Tier 4, like quite literally able to get into there and start farming and level up your glyphs and maybe start fighting the bosses there, everything in C tier and above can do that. You have to remember that they've also changed Paragon glyph leveling so that as long as you can run a pit tier 50 below the level of your glyph, so if you're trying to hit level 100 on your glyph, you'd only need to be able to run pit tier 50, barely just getting into World Tier 4. Everything in C tier and above can do this thing, but C tier is the average expectation. These are not trash builds. This is just what the average build's damage arguably might want to try to shoot for. Maybe that's where balance is at its finest. Currently, in Diablo 4, the majority of balance actually brings you into B and A tier. That's why you'll see we have the majority of builds here, where so many of our builds, the vast majority of them, all being above average. S is the best of the best. A are builds that have something holding them back from being the best of the best. B tier being above average builds that are more than competent and strong enough to do everything in the game and excel at various things. And then C tier is competent enough and strong enough to be considered good for doing anything in the game that you would want to do. Maybe not pushing the highest pit tier, but able to do pit tiers at all. But now that we understand that, let's go ahead and look at the pit builds for the Necromancer so I can shine some insight onto why the builds ended up where they are, the big things to understand walking out of Season 7 and into Season 8, and some of my general predictions for how this is going to shake out. So for endgame pit pushing on the Necromancer, we are arguably one of the stronger classes. Obviously everybody points to Bloodwave Necromancer. It's like, oh my god, this thing invalidated the whole game. Oddly enough, it was really only good at doing pit pushing and to a lesser extent bossing, because bossing is basically just pit pushing, but without having to run through the hallways first. But it was kind of trash for everything else. I don't know if you ever took a Bloodwave Necromancer and went out to the Witch Tide, and you kind of just sat there and did nothing while all of the Earthquake Barbs literally destroyed the entire screen while you were still trying to pick up Blood Orbs. Oddly enough, most pit tier builds are trash at doing other content. But when we're talking about the pit, this, again, pushing as high as possible, we currently are speculating that Bone Spear will be by far the strongest build, which is not necessarily what you're seeing across the majority of other lists, because so many people are still kind of afraid, a little bit gun shy about Bloodwave. But let me explain this difference here. In Season 7, Bloodwave was able to speed run Pit Tier 150. And the nerfs walking out of Season 7 dropped it down to doing 1% of its previous damage. Literally cut 2 zeros off of its total damage output. And what that meant was it was now able to speed farm somewhere around Pit Tier 125, which is still very high, but it was nowhere near as high as other builds which were in a contemporary state. There were Druids, Sorceresses, as well as Barbarians all running Tier 150 as well. And even in the Necromancer themselves, while 125 is still very high, there were other builds that were similar to that. Minions was just below that at Pit Tier 122. Army of the Dead at the time was actually way above that at Pit Tier 140. And Bone Spear Necromancer was somewhere in this range. A very powerful build, easily doing over Pit Tier 100. But the funny part was that basically it wasn't getting half of its damage. There were a multitude, a deluge of bugs leading Bone Spear to basically being completely hamstrung in the season. If you follow on the Reddit, I posted my magnum opus of all of the bug testing that I did, and this thing scrolls, baby. Now, luckily, we were able to get these bugs into the hands of the developers, and walking into this season, they seem to have fixed all of them. So, things that weren't working before. When you double cast for Bone Spear cast twice from Deathless, we weren't getting double the Bone Spears from the Indira's Pants, the one that turns into Blood Spear that eats a corpse to fire off another Bone Spear. Those Bone Spears were not piercing, and they weren't shooting back shards, cutting their damage output in half. When they would double cast, they wouldn't all spawn echoes from Deathless Visage. That would more than cut that damage in half. Not only that, the spears from the pants weren't overpowering when you hit a target in a bone prison, per the new Bone Dusters aspect from last season. On top of that, your echoes weren't overpowering to targets inside of bone prisons either. So all these things were leading to a build that built fully into overpower, and more than half the time just wasn't overpowering when it should be, meaning that all those damage multipliers were literally doing nothing. Because of all this, we weren't getting things like the Bone Spears healing when they overpowered inside of bone prisons, so we had to run things like Doombringer. Now, Doombringer is a decent item, but it doesn't actually directly multiply your damage. It increases your maximum life, which increases your additive overpower damage, but it doesn't have an aspect on it. It doesn't allow you to temper onto it, etc. So now we're going to be able to use a big honkin' two-handed weapon. We're going to be able to properly spec into some additive crit damage, be able to scale Deathless, be able to properly scale our maximum life and our healing so that we can maintain fortified stats, we can maintain maximum life for all of our overpower damage, we won't have to have lucky hit chance to be able to heal, etc., etc. So we are thinking right now, Bone Spear will end up being our strongest build, followed by Bloodwave. Now, Bloodwave still very, very strong build. Basically, the totality of the nerfs plus the very slight buff that they did to just the base damage, it was an 11% damage increase to the base damage, in addition to the reducing total damage down to 1%, as well as just like generally like making the build slower, clunkier, not having as many tools, be able to reduce cooldown and stuff like that. Bloodwave will still be very strong, but I think it will fall even further out of favor in doing open world content and the stuff like that, because it's just not going to be worth it. And then you have Bone Spirit. Bone Spirit's just always been a good build. There was a little while where it was our best build by far, and a couple of the nerfs that have come to overpower systems have kind of negatively impacted Bone Spirit indirectly, and it hasn't really gained anything altogether that powerful from the changes. Still a very solid build, definitely going to be in the S tier, but I think its gearing requirements are kind of just a little bit too high for what it offers you when things like Blood Spear and Blood Wave exist. Not only that, it's also just a build that's bad at speed farming, because its whole purpose is to group up as many enemies as possible and then literally nuke them from orbit. That's not great in things like Hordes or Helltide or running through a Nightmare dungeon, etc. Then we get into the A tier. If we look at the actual numbers for the builds in the A tier, so walking out of the PTR, Blood Wave without boss powers should be able to do like 105, which again, still very high. Don't get it twisted, still very high. But Sever, Blight, these are doing 88, 89, and this is again without the actual damage of the boss powers, and also not being able to see some of the changes that are coming most notably to the Zan rune, the thing that allows you to overpower for a split second. They've increased the base duration of that all the way up to 1/3 of a second, as opposed to 1/4 of a second. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but quite literally, like some missiles from skills wouldn't hit in time to actually overpower. That's how small of a window it was. And now that window is open for a long time, and it looks like you'll actually be able to potentially cast multiple skills during that window, because if you could generate enough offering, it increases the duration of this effect. So a lot of builds that can only barely overpower just from this rune are going to have wider windows of overpower ability. So things like Sever are actually going to get significantly stronger than they even were in Season 7, and a lot less clunky, a much smoother ramp up to damage. But definitely keep your eyes on Sever. It's a build that does function fairly well outside of pit pushing, because its base damage output is just kind of high enough. And now that you'll be able to proc overpower more proactively, you'll actually be able to bring this into other content too, as opposed to like having to completely swap out your gear like you kind of had to previously. Blight Necro is also just kind of like in a decent enough place. I do think that Blight Necro will actually continue to be able to scale some of the boss powers damage, like Belial's Eyes. Yes, they cut it down significantly, but we have a legendary node that says that we have a % chance to basically have our damage over time crit for all intents and purposes, and Belial's Eye Beams is shadow damage over time. So I still think it's going to be able to scale that pretty decently well. Blood Surge, another build that always kind of does pretty much good enough, definitely our best speed farming build. It just kind of blows up the entirety of the screen, bring this bad boy into Infernal Hordes, bring it through Nightmare Dungeons, and then walk it into the pit. You're not going to be performing anywhere near the level of S tier or even like Sever and Blight, but it's pretty decent. I'm putting it currently somewhere around like tier 87, tier 88 without the damage from boss powers. So I wouldn't be surprised if it gets even a little bit higher than that. Nothing really changing about it. It's just a really solid build. They added Crew War's Embrace, and now it can do single target and it can do AoE damage. It's basically like the perfect consideration. It's almost like the perfect power level that they should probably be balancing towards. Then we got Bloodlance. Here's the issue with Bloodlance. It's still strong enough to be able to clear these pit tiers, but depending on how they've actually implemented one of the changes to how Bloodlance is going to be working, this build might be like so unfun and just absolutely a drag to pilot that nobody's going to want to do it. The very long and short of it is they made it so that Bloodlance is able to spread the lanced status out to more targets, and when you hit a lance target, it deals damage to all the lance targets. The way it used to work, though, is that it would pierce and make a new projectile. That new projectile would hit, and then it would do its damage to everybody. And then it would pierce again, and it would hit somebody, it would do its damage to everybody. Now it just doesn't do that. The idea was that they were going to buff single target damage and slightly reduce AoE damage, and they basically killed our ability to do AoE damage in such a significant way that I'm not quite sure how it made it past the PTR, considering myself, as well as a lot of other people, sent in some very strong feedback about just how dysfunctional this was, and I'm not positive that they fixed it. So I would not be surprised if Bloodlance even dropped even further down. Let's talk about minions, because the biggest thing that they're gaining is the ability to overpower proactively through that same Zan rune. And just because we're going to be talking about it for a little bit, I might as well put it up on the screen. But basically, once you trigger Zan rune, you have a little pocket window of time where all of your attacks that hit the target during that time will overpower. This works on your minion's base damage. It works on Ring of Mendeln procs. It works on everything. I mean, it would work on your ultimate skill as well if your ultimate skill could overpower something like Army of the Dead. Now, that being said, minions don't use Army of the Dead because Soul Rift exists and it solves all of your problems and all of your survivability and also gives you a damage bonus. So, oddly enough, we don't tend to use anything else. But because, again, this is not only going to have an increased duration as a basis, but we'll be able to push it even further with more offering, although that's not currently represented in the planner because the data hasn't hit the live game yet. This opens up a massive window where your minions' damage can finally overpower. Now, there's a lot of confusion about how that works. Remember that minions completely scale off of you now. They scale off of your maximum life for overpower. If you have additive damage while you're fortified, that scales their damage too. The only thing that's particular to them are things that say your minions or this minion or summoning damage, etc. But minions are gaining a huge benefit out of this. Now, why am I not rating minions higher if they were already a decently strong build? Again, they ran pit tier 122 in season 7, and now they're gaining this, something they didn't have before. Well, it's because I ran a minion build using the Zan rune. Now, not the newest version of it, which will have a bigger duration, but I ran the Zan rune. I used Ahu and Zan to be able to generate a ton of offering because all of your minions can proc lucky hit chance now. Then the best I could do was a tier 70 without pushing, without fishing, and oddly enough, like without perfect gear. But if you need perfect gear to be able to output what you need to do, most people will never have that. So I was trying to set realistic expectations here. And the build just really didn't perform altogether that well. Oddly enough, you take a build that can barely do a pit tier 122, you increase scaling across all the pit tiers, you don't really give it altogether that much, and what do? You see a vast reduction in the pit tier that can run. Now again, these numbers are not going to match what happens in game because they've changed the scaling. But all that being said, even if you can get your minions to overpower significantly more than what we were doing in the PTR, I don't see this somehow bumping up to pit tier 100, not magically so. Or at least, rather, let me reframe it like this. I don't see this build gaining 30 pit tiers from this one change in the rune word. What I do see, though, is some opportunities for the build to be iterated on and to be optimized. And maybe, oddly enough, with enough people playing this build, you'll come up with something stronger than the thing that I came up with to test. That probably should happen. I'm neither omniscient, nor do I think that I have all of the game knowledge and nobody else does. So I know a lot of people are going to be trying this build. It's going to be a perfectly fine build, an above average build, but I don't see it getting out of B tier. And let me tell you, I hope I'm wrong. Honestly, I know the minion enjoyers are out there. I generally like playing minions in Diablo 4. The moment that I have a problem with it, though, is that if whatever you're fighting summons adds, like little minions around it themselves, all your dudes go running off and fight them instead of the boss. You were like in a pit push and you show up and you see that you have a boss that has a ton of minions, which typically is very good, but for a minion, Necromancer is the worst of the worst. There's some ways to be able to mitigate it. Some of the arenas are large enough where you can kind of pull them around. But you just watch all this damage get dropped into monsters your individual minions can't kill, and it ends up doing absolutely nothing. And that's what ends up pissing me off the most. Blizzard, please, please, for the love of this game, give me the ability to target an enemy with my minions. At this point, every other ARPG is doing it. It's not cool to be the hipster kid. We just got to be able to target. And then the build that nobody remembers exists and is arguably the reason why I even have a career in Diablo 4 and has sadly been absolutely just like gutted and left in a ditch on the side of the road. It's my boy Infinimist. Infinimist it's fine. It's average. You can create enough corpses to be able to consume the Black River to do an okay amount of damage over time. It's nowhere near Blight. That is nowhere near as clunky, has easier gearing restrictions, etc. You basically can't maintain permanent uptime on Blood Mist unless you put Explosive Mist on your amulet, which means you're dropping a ton of damage, and even then, the output that you get is mid, because oddly enough, casting skills manually will always be faster than automated skills triggering once every second or so. So Infinimist, sadly, is not a great build. It's a perfectly average build. It will be able to do okay. You'll be able to get into World Tier 4. If you really like the playstyle, it's there for you. I'm hoping that we don't have to wait until the expansion. I'm hoping that we can see some legitimate buffs to Corpse Explosion, a skill that at one point did damage on every single build, and now all it does is trigger Flesh Eater, as well as Fueled by Death and Grim Harvest. So there you go. I hope that that adds on the context that you're looking for. Now, I've seen a couple different comments that's like, hey, these tier lists are going to be wrong, blah, 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 blah. First and foremost, we have a team of like 1 million dudes, all who spend just like way too much time on this game. Most people putting out tier lists, especially those with the team, have a lot of really great insight. But I do want to put out this caveat. We don't know what the pit scaling is going to look like. We cannot possibly know of unknown bugs. But these tier lists aren't just kind of made up whole cloth, right? We spent a lot of time during the PTR testing these things. We have a very good understanding of what the impact of changes to individual skills or effects are. The really big outliers are whether or not any of the boss powers are continued to be able to be scalable based off of the numbers that they've changed, and what pit tiers will look like now that we don't know what the scaling number is. But the relative power of these builds, so maybe not the exact letter grade each one's in, but the relative power of these builds are going to be still relatively in the same place. They just might shift up or down. And if one of them does, they all are going to. So there might be some, crazy outliers out there. No question. Absolutely. Again, not gods. Literally are only human beings with the power to analyze data that's put in front of us. But the data that we're using is based off of some really, really strong stuff that we're able to pull from the sources that we can. So hopefully this gave us good enough insight to not lead y'all astray. I don't think we're going to brick any of your builds. And hopefully you're able to have a great time with whatever build you are the most excited to play. If you are looking forward to this season, let me know down in the comments. If you're brand new here, leave a like on the video. It helps me out a ton, but also subscribe to the channel. I don't bug you. I don't spam you with stuff. You just don't want to miss out on any videos when they go live. If you want to hang out with me during the season start, I'm going to be streaming both on Twitch as well as on YouTube, both at MacroBioBoi. Just copy and paste the channel name here. I basically made a labyrinth of a name that nobody can ever spell right, including myself half the time. So just copy and paste it. You'll be able to find me. I'm going to start streaming the moment the season goes live. I do have a little bit of a day job in the morning. I'm basically going to be streaming from when I get home to when I go to sleep, and then immediately get up, go to that day job, come back home, eat some lunch, get back to streaming. So it's going to be an unreasonable amount of coverage. I'm going to be playing every single Necro build. I'm going to be starting off with Blood Spear. I don't typically play like what the flavor of the month meta build is going to be, but I know that there's a lot of math that we haven't optimized on this thing yet, so I need to get my hands dirty firsthand so that I can be able to make sure that we have the best data possible for when Sirach is making the build guide here on Maxroll. Go ahead and check it out. He already has it updated if you want to go look at that right now. You know what? I'll leave a link in the description as well. But there you go. Thank you very much for watching this video. Again, subscribe if you haven't. Leave a like, comment, do all this stuff. I would appreciate it. Thank you very, very much for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.